I had a thing that I bring up from time to time. I've had a thing since I've been on radio. It occurred to me years and years and years ago. And I called it, this is probably 2020, it was 2002 maybe. I call it the Nixon Doctrine. And listen in for the Nixon Doctrine. So the Nixon Doctrine from Matt Murphy goes like this. It's not what you do that causes the most concern, consternation, and ultimately trouble when something goes wrong. It's how you react to it that gets you in the most trouble or gets you out of the trouble. In other words, the reason I call it the Nixon Doctrine, it was not the Watergate break-in that brought down Richard Nixon. It was the manner in which he reacted to it. It was not the idea that some guys got over-the-top crazy about finding out some sort of information. They did this informational operative where they broke into Democrat headquarters in the Watergate Hotel to try to glean information. This was CREEP, the Committee to Reelect the President, right? They did this, and it was wrong, and it was obviously illegal to break into someone else's rented or leased property. But that's not what brought Richard Nixon down. That's not what caused Richard Nixon to have to resign the presidency. What caused him to have to resign the presidency is the manner in which he reacted to it. When it was brought to him, whatever he knew prior to the break-in, when it was brought to him that this had happened, his response was, okay, how do we make this go away? How do we cover it up? Leading to the, whatever it was, 17 and a half, 18-minute missing tape deal because he was taping conversations in the White House, leading to further investigations. The media smelled blood, and they pounced because they always hated Richard Nixon, despite the fact that he was a fairly quality president the first time around and won re-election easily over his Democrat opponent. He did not need the break-in, which is the irony of all of this. So I call it the Nixon Doctrine in as much as Nixon reacted in a way that led to his demise. Now, obviously, there were plenty of other factors going on. I'm not here to debate Watergate. What I am here to say is as bad as Saturday was, as god-awful as Saturday was, as close as we were to, I don't know what, in terms of America's reaction to the assassination of a former president, a presidential candidate, the leading president, the now Republican candidate for president of the United States. I can't tell you the number of people since Saturday that have asked me the same question. It's a macabre question to ask, but it's one on all of our minds. What would have happened had he not missed? I don't know the answer to that. I hesitate to contemplate the answer to that. And I am thankful, and I get on my knees, and I pray to God Almighty, and I thank God Almighty that we don't have those conversations, and we don't have to contemplate that possibility. It's a natural question to ask. And so in the aftermath of this, in the immediate aftermath of this, boy, oh boy, we've got to tone down the rhetoric, everybody. We've got to turn down the temperature on the stove. Things have gotten out of control, say the leftists in the media. Things have gotten out of control, say ABC and CBS and NBC and MSNBC and hashtag never CNN. Things have gotten out of control, say the Washington Post, that just this April printed an op-ed piece indicating that it was perfectly acceptable to call Donald Trump Hitler. Things have gotten out of control, say the New York Times, who calls Hitler Donald Trump a fascist and Hitler-esque on the regular. The political liberals that have dehumanized Donald Trump for 8 years. The same political liberals and their operatives in the mainstream media that have told us that he is less than human, that he is an authoritarian, that he is a dictator, that he doesn't care anything about democracy, that he's going to destroy democracy as we know it unless somebody does something. Unless somebody does something. Now those same people are telling us that we need to calm down, that we need to calm down. That we, you and me, Trump supporters of the guy that just almost got his head blown off, we need to calm down. Oh, they don't need to calm down. Let me tell you something. When they say we need to tone down the rhetoric, they're not talking about themselves. AP, and I put this out on my social media. If you're not following me on @MattMurphy Show, you're doing it wrong. @MattMurphy Show. I'm all over the X Machine. The X Machine is a cesspool. It's non-human people saying non-human things. It's an awful place, and I'm there all the time. So come on over and see me @MattMurphy Show. Actually, I like what Elon's done to the place. @MattMurphy Show. It's a bastion of free speech. And with free speech, you get a lot of deplorable speech. But I brought this up. The Associated Press, right? I mean, a once respected media organization that reminded us that we need to, quote unquote, tone down the rhetoric. The same Associated Press had a headline earlier today that I want to share with you as soon as my Wi-Fi works. 2.5 days after the media outlets on record wagged their fingers at all of us to tone down the rhetoric, the political rhetoric, AP used this in a headline discussing J.D. Vance. By the way, yesterday, J.D. Vance, during our show, announced as the vice presidential candidate on the ticket with Donald Trump. Great selection. If you don't know his backstory, it's a fabulous backstory. He grew up in somewhat poverty. He had a mother that was addicted to drugs. He overcame that. J.D. Vance has a story that strikes a chord in my heart because if it were not for my grandparents, I would not be here. If it were not for my grandmother and my grandfather, I don't know what would have happened to me. My father left my family when I was 5 years old. My mother had brain cancer when I was 5 years old. She had a malignant brain tumor that affected her for the rest of her life. And she spent the last 15 years of her life in a nursing facility, in an assisted living facility. Without the guidance of my grandfather particularly, but my grandfather and my grandmother as a couple, they became my parents, and I don't know where I would be. J.D. Vance has a very similar story. I have an appreciation for that story. I did not know this until last night, that J.D. Vance is not J.D. Vance's last name that he was born with. He was born with his father's last name, obviously. His father left the family, and he eventually took the last name of his grandparents, or his maternal grandparents. I get emotional thinking about this. I considered taking my grandparents. My maternal grandparents were Wilsons. My grandfather was Cecil Wilson, my grandmother Ann Wilson. Judson was her middle name, and I knew when my grandfather was mad at her because he'd call her Judson, and it would anyway, that's a side story. Another story for another day. Judson! And her face would get all red. She didn't like Judson. But I considered, because of my background and because my dad abandoned us, I thought about in my teenage years and in my early 20s changing my last name to Wilson. I eventually didn't do it, but I thought about it. But I knew who my real dad is, right? So J.D. Vance has a very similar story. Joined the United States Marines. He is a Marine, once a Marine, always a Marine. And then eventually became an entrepreneur, went to law school, graduated magna cum laude in law school, or summa cum laude, I think, in law school. I mean, it's an incredible backstory. This is an amazing person. And came to Trump fairly and squarely. We're going to talk about this a little bit later on. Was not a fan of Donald Trump's in 2016. I mean, aggressively against Donald Trump. Would classify himself as a never Trumper. And the media is going to seize on that, and liberals are going to seize on that. Look, this guy was a never. Listen to what he said in 2016. Here's the wonderful thing. If Trump can win you over, if Trump can win J.D. Vance over, imagine what Trump can do to the left if the media and the operatives in the Democrat Party covered him honestly and fairly with regard to what he wants to do for this country and what he wants to do for the American people. J.D. Vance says that he was absolutely aggressively anti-Trump. When asked what happened, he said Trump happened. He proved me wrong. That is such a testimony to the man and the mission. But back to the point, the same Associated Press that told us not 3 days ago that, boy, we need to tone down the rhetoric. Boy, we need to calm it down a little bit. Here's the headline. J.D. Vance is a relative political unknown. He's been asked to help Donald Trump avenge his 2020 loss. Now, this might seem like nothing. It seems like nothing because they do it all the time. And when we stop pointing it out is when it becomes a part of the narrative, and that's what I want to avoid. He's been asked to help Donald Trump avenge his 2020 loss. Donald Trump wants vengeance. Donald Trump wants to make America great. Donald Trump wants to see a finish of the job that he started between 2016 and 2020. Avenge. Look that word up. That word was used in that headline intentionally. Just look it up. Avenge. What does that mean? And why would they use it in an article announcing the running mate of the former president? Avenge is a verb. It means to inflict harm in return for an injury. They could have used, it might seem like a little thing. It's not a little thing. It is an indicator to me and to you, it should be an indicator that they have no interest in toning down their rhetoric. Joe Biden, a day after Donald Trump was nearly assassinated, continued to call him a threat to democracy. I want to know what that word means. I want to know if there are any liberals during the Libertarian Lunchtime Hour that can tell me what that phrase means. When you say, when you hear Joe Biden, you liberals out there, you listen to Joe, and he's stumbling and bumbling, and he's a Roomba on the stage, and then eventually, Donald Trump's a threat to democracy. What does that mean? What does that mean? I'm being serious. What does that mean when Joe Biden says that Donald Trump is a threat to democracy? Because I sincerely do not know what he's talking about. That worst case scenario that Donald Trump, will stay in power? Well, he didn't the last time. Well, he tried to. Well, he didn't. What? I don't know what they're talking about. It sounds good in a soundbite. No one questions the liberals like, yeah, he's a threat. What are you talking about? What? That Donald Trump at the age of, let's say he wins this next election. How old's Trump? 77? I got no answers in there. 77? Is that right? No, never mind. You're not listening. 77. I'll go with that. He'll be 81? What, he's going to stay? He's going to convict? What are you talking about, threat to democracy? It is not a threat to democracy to have a different set of priorities and a different set of ideas about how the country needs to move forward. It's not a threat to democracy to suggest that the federal government has grown bloated beyond its comprehension. It's not a threat to democracy to suggest that we need to keep our sovereign borders just that sovereign. These are not threats to democracy.